What's out there? What creates the shadows in the corners or the creatures of the dark? Who are those on the other side? What do they have to say? This is the Gateway Podcast. This is not your normal style of paranormal talk radio. Brought to you live from United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM New Orleans.
Welcome to the Gateway broadcast live from United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM New Orleans. I'm your host, C.L. Thomas. Hello, guys, from Las Vegas. So it's finally cold. I'm going to give you guys the weather report. It has been snowing finally up around Mount Charleston. It's not too much snow, though. In the landscape around me, though, it's still pretty dry, and it's cold at night, but a little bit warm during the day. I just got back from Charleston, South Carolina. If you guys ever been there, it was really cold and you would never believe it. We had an ice storm while I was there, but I did get to do a lot of neat stuff. Like I got to see Edward Teach's house where he used to stay. If you guys know who Edward Teach is, it was Blackbeard. Hi, Joe Fox. How are you? So Blackbeard used to stay at this house, and I wish I would have pulled up a photo. There's actually a photo of it on my social media if you look it up. It's a little itty bitty house, but it's been there since, it's like 200 years old. But Blackbeard, of all people, used to stay in his house. And there's a tunnel that runs from the house all the way to Cooper's River, which is a couple of blocks at least. And the story goes that if the governor knew that he was in town, he would send a brigade after him because he wanted to hang the guy. And so he would get in the tunnel just like, I don't know if you've ever seen, of course you've seen it, the pirate movies with, what's his name? I forget his name, but you know what I'm talking about. One of the main characters is Blackbeard always escapes. Well, it's a true story. So the tunnel, he would get in the tunnel and run every time, but he did eventually meet his demise. But speaking of Blackbeard, I don't know about you guys, but I've always been fascinated with treasures and gold hunting. I always carry around a metal detector with me when I'm out in the desert. I always look for old coins and things like that. So my guests tonight are two brothers, Rick and Brian Antonson. They're historians, and they've written a book, Slumach's Gold, In Search of a Legend and a Curse. A lot of you probably know the TV series on the History Channel, Dead Man's Curse. Well, I think it was Brian. I can't remember which one just told me this. One of them told me that he was actually interviewed on this show. But without further ado, let me get them on here.
Hello.
Hi, guys. Welcome to the show.
Hi, CL. Thanks for having us on.
I'm really excited to have you guys on here.
Well, us too. And you mentioned Blackbeard. There's a map at the start of the Slumach's Gold book that talks about it being one of the 5 or 6 most famous lost treasures in North America. One of the other ones on the map is Blackbeard's.
Really? They never found any of Blackbeard's gold, have they?
Have not. At least if they had, they cashed it in somewhere and didn't go public. But it remains lost, and Slumach's Gold remains lost, and they're each among the top 10 in terms of famous and pursuits of lost treasures in North America.
So Slumach's Gold, you guys, this is like the 3rd version of this book that's coming out. Did you guys redo it because of the TV show Dead Man's Curse?
No, the TV show came out as we were doing this. The first version, our colleague Mary Trainer, and Rick and me back in the early 70s decided that we would take this legend that we'd heard since we were kids, and we would make something out of it, put it into a book. And so our first book, a 56-page thing, we thought that we would collect all the information on Slumach, kind of put the legend to rest, because a lot of it is legendary and a lot of it is simply not fact. So we thought we'd done that with that first book. Well, all we did was ignite the interest of a whole bunch of other seekers who have spent their entire lives looking for the gold. We eventually sold the rights to that book after 10,000 in sales, and in Canada, 5,000 is a bestseller. So we had eventually sold off that, and the company that owned it and still owns it, Heritage House, one of British Columbia's largest publishers, said to us in 2006, it's your 35th anniversary coming up. We'd like to see a much expanded version of that. And so that we tucked into that, and that resulted in our 2007 book, which has now sold 15,000 copies. So the first two books together have sold 25 grand, and that's a lot of books in Canada. And then with the success of that and all the new information that had come out and so on, we've been talking for a few years to the Heritage House people about an edition that might come out in 2024 or 2025. And so they and we worked together on this wonderful production that you have in front of you now. This is a real coffee table book. It's 8 by 10 in size. Lots of color photographs and maps. It really is the here we go. It really is the we call it a capstone edition. We're in our mid 70s now, all of us, and we don't know that we have another book. If somebody came along and said, "Hey, we found Slumach's gold," then we would be all over that. But this is all of the information that anybody would want about the lost gold mine, the searches for it, the truth behind the legends behind the legends, all of that up to date. So while it's a capstone version, it is far different, far improved from the other two versions. Much larger and it's a real new work.
Who did all the photography in this?
A variety of people. Much of it's historic photography that we were able to access, or documents that we were able to get refined with technology today that made them able to be reproduced and readable, so that others could be almost like they were touching it in an archive. That was good. And then a variety of people, from Don Wade, who's been in this longer than we have, and Adam Palmer, who's sort of the lead fellow on Dead Man's Curse. They provided us with photographs, and we were able to get more. What happened was that the publisher said, "You've got a tremendous book here. You've got lots of lore. You've really separated fact from fiction. You're doing a great job of storytelling. We want to accent it with additional photographs so that the reader gets a sense of, hey, that might be the creek, or it's alleged that the gold was found by someone who tucked some of it under a tent-shaped rock. That might be the tent-shaped rock." So they wanted photographs of all of that. And as turned out, we were able to source some genuinely beautiful photographs. So it takes the reader right into this legend, which we may want to tell you a little bit about this guy who got hung and put a curse on the gold mine, which is why dozens of people have been recorded as dying looking for it because of the curse. And why, with this new book out, we know there's going to be a whole new batch of gold seekers, fortune hunters, who are going to want to go into what is some of the most treacherous geography in British Columbia, which means some of the most treacherous geography in North America, because that's the province that this takes place in. Nice little corner right above Seattle for people who are wondering about the geography. If you come up the West Coast, this legend is about 30 miles outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, which is just 3 hours north of Seattle, Washington. So that's the tucked away corner where the gold is lost.
I think that's the one thing that the photographs really kind of highlight for me, is that the terrain that we're talking about here. It's easy to talk about, like I always talk about the West, the Southwest, the desert mining towns that I always hike out to. Nobody really understands that unless I show them a photo of how remote these places really are. So these photos that you're showing in this book, it really highlights how jagged that terrain is and how rough that is for people to go out there gold seeking, which is really fun. We're going to get into all that. But before we do, how did you guys get started into this topic?
Go for it, Rick. Talk about the
we tell
story story ever.
In the book. As Brian just said, it's been called the best campfire story ever. So you have to picture me at 8 and my older, wiser brother at 9. We're at a boys' camp out in what's called the Fraser Valley in British Columbia in Canada, not far from Vancouver. And it's the end of a week wrapping up stuff. And we've been out for that day at dusk fishing, caught fish. We're back with the fisherman and the fisher's wife, who also is the camp cook. We've got the two of us, 4 other guys. We're tired. We're cooking the fish over the coals of the campfire. And then as the coals sort of get brighter, but the flames are going down and it's dark, the fisherman's wife leans over the campfire, locks eyes with each of us, and tells us the legend of Slumach's gold. And she begins by saying, there's a lost gold mine, and she kind of winks over this way, meaning not far from here. And she says to us, but none of you will ever find it and live, because it's protected by a curse that a native, an indigenous man named Slumach made on the gallows just before he was hung for the murder of Louis B. And that was the campfire. We became captivated by this. And anytime we as a family, mom and dad, younger brother, younger sister, drove down the road from that camp, the hour-and-a-half drive home, one of us would look as we passed over the Pitt River Bridge, and we'd look up towards Pitt Lake, Pitt Lake, which had the indigenous lands in the area. And one of us would say to the other, one day we're going to go find Slumach's gold. Doesn't matter about the curse.
Did you ever find it?
No, this is the bravado of 9-year-old kids, or 9 and 8-year-old kids. We decided somewhere along the way, we started to do some there were newspaper articles and things like that. So we started to do some learning on this, and we realized as we got older that a lot of people had reportedly died in searching for this. One of our early interviewees when we were doing the first book said, this is the worst topographical area in the entire province. And it is. I mean, as you say, when you look at the photos, a lot of it is straight up and down. Mm-hmm. And it's easy to walk off a cliff or be walking along a trail, and all of a sudden it gives way and boom, you're down 200 feet and you're dead. And so enough of that sort of thing had happened. And of course, every time somebody did die, they said, aha, that's Slumach's curse. Excuse me. So we realized that probably it wasn't a good idea to go up in the bush looking for this, but we could talk to the people who had, we could do the research, we could flesh out the stories and bring together a book. And so that was our focus. We became chroniclers of the legends and of the truth, in fact, rather than actually going and looking for the gold ourselves. Now, we have been up there. We have been up in that area. We've been up Pitt Lake a few times and stayed up there and so on. But to say that we had actively gone searching for the mine, no.
Is there any paranormal tied to the land that we're talking about, Pitt Lake?
Well, if one takes the curse and then adds in the geography, one of the things that, and Brian was alluding to this, you could be on the lake and fog can come in out of nowhere. And sometimes it was said that the fog was a result of the curse protecting the mine. That there's a television show called Treasure in 1957, and it has them looking for this. It was an American television show, and it has them almost at this creek where their research and their being on the ground tells them they're going to find the gold nuggets. And all of a sudden fog comes in and they close the television show saying it was Slumach's curse that brought in the fog. Now, in fairness, Pitt Lake is a good sized lake, and it's a tidal lake, so it can be 4 to 6 feet difference, high, low tide. It can have a windswept afternoon that begins when you're out sunning and canoeing along. and you look over, and in many places, the shore is 100% inhospitable. It is just climate out, so you can't beach it. You can't beach your canoe and then hustle ashore to get out of the wind. If you run up against that, the wind's going to swack your canoe into the side of a rock cliff. And this is like a lot of rock cliff, so it's not like you just canoe a little further and get out. So with all of that, there is this sense of people who died, and the rumors becoming that they must have been really close to finding the gold, and the curse set in.
So, who was Slumach? Can you talk about him for a little bit?
Slumach was a Katzie man, Katzie being one of the local indigenous tribes. And he, we don't know for sure. There's no historical record as to his birth. We do know that he died by hanging on January the 16th of 1891. We do know that the descriptions of him at the time were that he was around 80 years old. So we kind of back that up and we say that maybe around 1810 or so on, he was born. Probably born in the Fraser Valley here, probably born near Pitt Lake. And he lived for a long time at a small reservation just at the south end of the lake. And there, he really was of no consequence. Nobody knew anything about him and so on. There's Rick is, and of course the listeners can't see this, but Rick is showing a picture of a certain television show that hired a character to act as him, and he was about 80 years old, and he had the long white hair that the newspaper reports talked about. So until then, he had maybe been a hunter. There was lots of railway activity through here in those days. There were logging camps, and there were fishermen and so on who plied those waters. And so Slumach may have been a hunter for them. He may have gone out and shot a deer or two and brought it into them and sold it to them and whatnot. But there was no real notice of any kind about Slumach until one day. He'd had a long time feud with a guy named Louis B. And one day when Louis B. and some others were hunting and fishing and so on, Slumach came out of the bush, and Louis B. Said, "What are you doing here?" And he raised his tomahawk, his axe, at him in a threatening fashion. And so Slumach said, "I'm going to shoot you." And he shot him. And that was the murder for which he was ultimately hanged. And so he was a guy who lived. There's absolutely no question that he lived. The accounts of his capture, his trial, and his hanging and so on are a matter of reporting here in British Columbia. And then everything died down afterward because, okay, it's another guy who killed somebody. He's been hanged. Good night. And that's it. But within a few years, there was a rumor circulating that the actual Slumach had a lost gold mine with nuggets the size of walnuts. And of course, that sort of thing goes crazy. Now, there was no proof. You know, in a court session, it was a 3-hour hearing and a 15-minute sequestering of the jury. But there would have been, if he'd been throwing gold nuggets around the saloons of New Westminster, as the legend says, somebody would have reported that, because gold nuggets the size of walnuts, everybody wanted one. And so somebody would have reported that in the newspapers of the day, the only media of the day. And there was no such mention. And it wasn't until about 6 years after Slumach died that the first public mention of a Slumach lost gold mine came to be. And so we chronicle that, and there's been many researchers looking at this over the decades, but nobody knows for sure what happened in those 6 years to create that legend. But we do know that the three people behind a company called the Slumach Lost Mine Company, the three people behind that in 1897 were the editor of the newspaper of the day, the defense attorney of the day in Slumach's trial, and the mayor of the town of New Westminster where this all happened. And they were three key people. Now, we can't find any other information as to why they came up with this Slumach Lost Mine Company, but we do know that each of them was involved with the actual trial.
And what information might they have kept out of the
Yeah, that's
newspaper of the day?
interesting. Yeah.
What information might they have been privy to? What might they have known from Slumach in his cell before he was taken to the gallows and hung? And what motivated them to believe that they should raise funds and go looking for gold that this Indigenous man reportedly had? So part of that is like, and we write this in our book, that to every legend, think of any legend in North America, think of any American legend, think of the Lost Dutchman's mine, think of Montezuma's lost gold. And the thought is that to every legend, there is the first person that told it. And what did they know that prompted them? Was it a lark, or was it something that was a sliver of truth, or maybe a bit more truth? So at the time Slumach was out hunting, as Brian described, in and around that area, I mean, British Columbia had gone through, there was the California gold rush, the people coming up through Oregon, the new state of Washington, and the new province of British Columbia, the Caribou Gold Rush. It wasn't yet the time. This is much earlier than the Klondike Gold Rush, but the other famous West Coast North American gold rushes were happening, and there was a lot of gold around. So had he waylaid a prospector who had found gold in the Caribou, was traveling down to New Westminster near Vancouver to deposit it, had he gotten nuggets or gold dust from such a person? Did he perhaps find a modest amount of gold and kept it to himself, did not go into town and boast about it, but did he have gold? So did these people who started, as Brian was saying, this Slumach enterprise, know something that the rest did not know? But the legend kind of catapults, and Brian's quite conversant in this, but by the early 1900s, when a character named Jackson comes onto the scene, and then by the 1920s and 30s, where the sort of salacious stories began to circulate, that's when the legend comes alive, and the curse is as real to readers of those magazines and those newspaper accounts in those days as our conversation right now is to people. They believed it happened. They believed gold was there to be found, and they were willing to risk their lives against a curse by an Indigenous man on the gallows.
And that gallows curse is a real factor here. According to the legend, and of course this is, a mixture of fact and fiction, according to the legend, as he stood on the gallows, Slumach said, "Nika memlus, mine memlus," which in the local Chinook Indigenous jargon meant, "When I die, mine dies." And so people have focused on that curse that was uttered, and we call it on the front of our book. It's a gallows curse, but there is no evidence that Slumach ever said a word on the gallows. He was brought up. The witnesses who were there say he was brought up the stairs, and he stood there, and they put the noose around his neck and the hood over his head, and he said nothing, and it dropped, and he was gone. So there is no evidence from the reporters, the witnesses who were standing there, that Slumach had ever uttered a curse. But what's a legend of lost gold without a curse, right? And so this legend has been there forever.
Brian, though, there's a lot of legends around where I live, where the Native Americans used to occupy, and once the people came in and took their land from them, there are stories about them cursing the land.
Sure, there's lots of them, and that's why that sort of thing has legs. But there's no record that Slumach ever actually said this curse. But people believe that, and of course, then anytime somebody walks off a cliff or dies of starvation in the outdoors or whatever, It was Slumach.
Slumach's curse. Well, how many people died looking for this gold?
One
There
of
was
the
a
newspapers,
Yeah.
when our first book came out in 1972, and at that time, the Vancouver Province, one of the daily newspapers, a prominent, prestigious publication still around today, had recorded 23. Then there was later reference to 30. That's all by 1972. So it had a reality in the minds of many people. Now, as we both mentioned, this could have been calamity on behalf of those who died. We're very clear when we're talking in a situation like this that as much as we know the book is compelling and gives enough fact and an explanation of fiction that people will be motivated to go looking for the lost creek or for a stash of gold, that will happen. We're very mindful to say, be careful, be prepared. Do not go into Pitt Lake, British Columbia area just for a hike without letting someone know where you're going, without being prepared to maybe not make it back by the end of the day and need to spend time out there. So don't just go out when it's sunny and you're canoeing. Take with you preparations and safety material so you could survive a couple of nights if you got washed ashore by whipped up high winds, or if you got out and you were hiking and fog crept in and you couldn't see your hand in front of you and you had to make camp and keep warm and survive 2-3 days before you could get out. Don't be cavalier about going looking for Slumach's gold. If you're going to go looking for it, make sure you and those you are with are prepared and see it for what it is. And that's hiking and trekking in seriously dangerous country, which protects the legend and has taken the lives of many people who went looking for the lost gold.
Have any of those people died mysteriously, or are they all from the elements? In
Various things. An example, a guy from Washington, as a matter of fact, just below us, a guy named Louis Hagbo. He went, excuse me, something cut in my throat here. He went out in the bush and he died. And of course, his body was found, and everybody said, oh yeah, well, that's Slumach's curse again. Well, in actual fact, he had a heart attack, and he was 65 years old or something like that.
Jackson.
So, sorry?
You got to tell about Jackson.
Oh, yeah, I'll tell about Jackson.
Go to San Francisco.
Yeah. So Louis Hagbo, it was 1962, I think, when he died, something like that. So that there's a modern version of something. But there was a guy, 1901. So we had the Alaskan gold rush in the late 90s. And a guy named, according to legend, again, there's no proof he even existed, but according to the legend, a guy named named W. Jackson, and that's all we know. And various people give him the name John, or others give him the name Walter. But the only record we have on a letter that he supposedly wrote, he signed it W. Jackson. He came to New Westminster on his way home from Alaska. And as he's in New Westminster for a few days, waiting to take a ship south to San Francisco, his home place, he heard the story of Slumach's lost gold. So Slumach died in 1891. Here we are now, a decade later, in 1901, and Jackson is supposedly in town, and he hears these rumors. So he says, well, I'm going to go up there and find it. So he goes off into the bush around Pitt Lake, and 3 months later, he comes out, and he's a broken man. He is very sick. He's waiting for another ship down south, but he keeps his backpack with him all the time. Won't let it out of his sight. And so he has this thing with him, and it's very heavy. He goes back to San Francisco, and the rumor is that he deposited $8,000 of raw gold in the Bank of British North America.
In $1901.
Sorry?
In $1901.
In $1901. Oh, yes, $1901. So in 1906, of course, we have the earthquake in San Francisco. The bank where he made his deposit, all its records, all the paper and everything, they're destroyed. earthquake and the fire and so on. So there's no way to prove that Jackson either existed or that he had any any actual gold deposited. But supposedly he was sick and he was dying. Supposedly before he died in 1904, he sent a letter to a Seattle guy, and he said, "I'm going to tell you where you will find these riches, and I'm going to give you directions. All you have to do is follow these directions." And he said something about when you're standing in a location where you can see three-pointed peaks and all this sort of stuff. But there was no real map or no real good directions like 5 miles north and 3 miles east or anything like that. It just wasn't that distinct, and the country's wild and so on. So without any proof that legend is true, people have been using the Jackson letter as it's known, and like I said, they attached the name John or Walter, but as it sits there, all it said was W. Jackson. They used the Jackson letter as an inspiration to go up north of Pitt Lake looking for gold, and in that he said I could only carry out a certain amount myself, so I left the rest buried under the tent-shaped rock there. Well, everybody says, hey, there's tent-shaped rock. We can go and find. It's just a rock that looks like an old miner's tent. That's simple, except that there are dozens or maybe hundreds of them up in that area, and everybody's got their own favorite. In our book, we've probably got, I don't know, Rick, 5 or 6 different tent-shaped rocks. We've got a whole bunch. Yeah, there's one Rick is showing on camera at this point in time that the listeners can't see. But there are literally no end of tent-shaped rocks up in that area. So I found one. We're going after it. And then you dig around and there's no gold, so there you go. So Jackson is very fictional too. There's no hard evidence that he existed. But around that time, a lot of people started going looking for the mine. Early 1900s.
Have you guys had anything? You've been researching this topic for a long time now. Have you run across anything to where it just kind of shocked you with this research?
Well, I met with a fellow. The Columbia newspaper was the other third daily in the area, and it is the newspaper where they had the ads, and Brian identified 3 of the people engaged with it. Years later, as we began researching this in the early 1970s, a fellow named Rick Taylor, his family owned the Columbia newspaper. He was encouraging of our searching for it. The newspaper had covered the legend at various times as it sort of got anchored into the public consciousness and grew in its reputation around the world. And in the 1990s, early 2000s, Rick Taylor invited me to lunch, and over lunch told me, he said, they found Slumach's gold. Now I was shocked. But I said, well, really? I mean, so many people have been looking for it. Any proof? And he had a plastic satchel with some ore in it, some rock that he said had been assayed and shown there was gold in there. He had within this bag the assay report, and it sat on the table as we had lunch and talked about it. And then at the end, he gave me the plastic bag, said, I'd like you to have this. And then he said, I'm going to draw you a map. And he took a napkin and drew roughly where this had been found, not on Pitt Lake, on another lake called Harrison Lake. We write about this in the book. So I was shocked. I have to admit, because this is a missing gap of evidence, I had that for a long time. And my archives for my various travel books and for our Slumach archives were taken by Simon Fraser University and are on a skid somewhere or in their archives. I have lost that bag. And I think it could well be in the archives at Simon Fraser University, or it It is in somewhere. I've moved since then. I don't think I've got it here. I don't think I gave it to Brian, or it's in his place, which could never be found. You'd have an easier time finding Slumach's gold at Pitt Lake. But where is it? But I was, so that was one thing that shocked me. And there have been others. I think that the realization, and this doesn't maybe come as a shock, but the realization about the sort of yellow journalism, the willingness to disregard fact and to fabricate a good story and embellish it and hire an artist to portray Slumach not as an 80-year-old man, but as a young rogue with a cigarilla hanging out of his mouth, dance hall girl sitting on his lap, strewing nuggets across the bar. All of that happened in the 30s, particularly a journalist wouldn't, perhaps totally unfair to journalists to use that term to designate this man, but CV were his initials, Tinch. And he wrote these stories willingly embellishing what had happened in the early 1900s and the 1920s. The man from Wisconsin, Brian, who had come up looking for this missing gold mine. So all of that was there. So, while some of it was legendary, there began to be facts of occasions that could be documented, and some of these people were dying. And then all of a sudden, this curse had a real grasp on people, like as though the noose was around their own neck. And so some of that was exhilarating, but some of it was like a cold water splash on your face, maybe more than shocked. But I don't know, Brian, were you ever shocked?
Yeah, I don't think there was anything ever shocking. There was certainly an awful lot to learn, and there were new bits and pieces of information coming out all the time. And as we would be talking with somebody, there might be something interesting. I'd say, "Oh, wow, I haven't heard that one," and so I'd add that to our research and then follow up on that. But there was nothing really shocking. No, not to me. But I agree with Rick. The Rick Taylor story. They found the mine, and here's some gold from it. That was a bit of a shock for him, and I understand that's an interesting sidelight.
Well, what about the mine though that he pulled it out of? Do you know where that is?
Well, that's the thing. Where Rick Taylor's? Yeah, Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, he drew me this map, which I tucked in the plastic bag with the rocks and the gold and the assay report. And
man,
yeah, I mean, shame on me for losing it. But I recently ran into a fellow, my vintage, who lives in the Vancouver area, quasi-retired, but has been very active with a number of mining companies. And I subsequently introduced him to Brian as well. He has reports from what is, say, the east side of Harrison Lake down towards the southern part of the lake. And this lake is within 20 miles of Pitt Lake. And it had a routing with gold seekers coming down from the Caribou. So it fits with the history. But he drilled for a company up there in the 90s, and he's got all the reports, and they found gold. It was not commercially viable. It also, he says, today, if it was commercially viable, would not get mined because it's within sight of what's called Harrison Hot Springs, which is a major resort tourist area, and it would be a blight on the landscape. But there are also stories, and this one might qualify as shocking because it's the one that Brian believes to be true. So he's a skeptic. I'm a skeptic, but I think they've been finding gold in the area. And Brian actually has a story about gold being found, except it is in what is designated as a provincial park, and therefore mining is forbidden. But I was shocked that Brian believed this guy had gold, because it's the story writ large, is it not, Brian?
So I can tell that story. Prospectors, people who seek gold will say, well, gold's where you find it. And this particular area around Pitt Lake doesn't have the right geology and so on that geologists would say, well, that's, the kind of place where you're going to find some gold. But a prospector will say gold is where you find it. And there's lots of rich areas north and east and whatnot, and in the Fraser Valley where people have found placer gold and things like that. There was this guy that Rick refers to. His name was Stuart Brown. He was a qualified man. He had a master's degree. He worked for the provincial and the federal government, and he was the forestry guy in this area around Pitt Lake. And he was one day within the bounds of one of these provincial parks, and there are two up there, and he wasn't certain exactly which area, which park he was in, but he knew that he was within the bounds of a provincial park. So he's walking along, and he's out in the bush all by himself, as he often was, and he's got his waterproof boots on and so on, and he kind of wanders into this very shallow pond, and he looks down, and he sees everything is gold and sparkling. So he reaches down and pulls up in his hand a bunch of gold nuggets the size of walnuts. And it's very heavy. His hand is shaking and so on as he's holding all these nuggets. And he says, I found it. I found Slumach's mine. But being the good company man he was, he said, I can't take this gold out. So I'll leave it here and I'll go back and I'll report it to the provincial government. So he went to, first of all, went to the minister who was responsible for this area. And he said, I have found gold. And it's within the bounds of a provincial park. But I found it, and I believe it's the legendary Slumach lost gold. And the guy said, well, there's no, we can't go in there. We can't mine it and so on. So forget it because it's within a provincial park. And he said, you don't have to mine it. You reach into the water and you come up with this stuff in your hands. There's no mining involved. And he said, there's enough there. He felt there were millions and millions and millions at the time. He said, we can pay off the provincial debt with this. All we have to do is take a few people in there and bring it up. Well, I've read through a couple of times the 1-inch thick stack of correspondence that he had with these guys in our provincial capital, trying to convince them. He died in his mid-80s of Parkinson's disease, but he was a very bitter man because he tried to convince these people who were in charge at the time, when he was much younger, that the gold was there. All they had to do was go in and find it. And he knew it. He knew exactly where it was supposed to be, but it was to his everlasting frustration that nobody would pick him up on that. Now, one of our colleagues, another writer, a fellow named Don Waite, had lunch with him one day, and he said, okay, so roughly where is this? So Stu Brown told Don where it was, and of course Don knew the territory well. He knew where the lakes were, he knew where the glaciers were, and everything. And so after lunch, he hustled out to the parking lot, sat down in his car, and he drew his own sketch map showing the exact location according to this Stu Brown guy. And we published that map. That map is in our book. Now it's a small map. It's a huge area, so it can't be precise or exact. But that's the closest, I think. I believe Stu Brown. The guy existed. He was a very qualified man. He was working for the governments at the time. So I have no question about his credibility, his viability. I think he actually found gold. Whether it was Slumach's gold, because there's no evidence that Slumach had any gold, but whether it was his gold, the legendary gold or whatever, I don't know. But there, I believe, is gold in that area. Gold is where you find it.
Did the curse ever affect him?
Well, it's arguable that his Parkinson's disease may have been Slumach's gold or Slumach's curse. And there are those who say, oh, yeah, well, Stu Brown, he died because of the curse. Well, he died at 85 of Parkinson's disease. He died in his bed, probably in a hospital. Does that mean that the curse was working on him? We're all going to die at some point in time. If I get hit by a truck tomorrow, oh, Slumach's curse. That's what people will say.
I would spread that rumor.
Well, you know what though? Why didn't he go back to pick it up himself?
He did. He went back with one person, and they were thwarted by weather. All of a sudden, the weather just turned really, really bad. And
Okay,
they
so
were
that's
in the middle.
the curse right there.
That's the curse.
That's exactly. Oh,
That's the curse. He could not validate, right?
It happens all the time up there. And so, they got rained out. They just couldn't go any further. Landslides and mudslides and things like that. Another time, they got blisters, and they were in such pain that they said, "Oh, we got to turn around." Now, is that the curse? One guy had new boots. One guy had older boots. One of the rules about hiking is you never wear new boots. You work them in, right? You spend a lot of time wearing those boots in so you don't run into blisters. So, and he was getting older and older every time, and he was getting sicker and sicker. So it just, at some point in time, it became impossible for him to go back up there. They did try to get up there via helicopter, but flying around and so on, they just couldn't find, he knew the route on land. He did not know the route from the air.
So let me add in here that there was an earlier television series, which you can still find someplace, called Search for the Frozen Gold. Curse of the Frozen Gold.
Curse of the Golden Frozen Gold, yeah.
Curse of the Frozen Gold. And this was maybe 2014. And both of us were involved a little bit with it, but more, much more behind the scenes. And Don Waite and some others, Brian has mentioned, were a part of it. The last two episodes were to involve both of us. And one was where I think if Slumach had gold, he would have found it, is called Widgeon Creek, Widgeon Lake area, not far from where Slumach's cabin was on the reserve, and not far from where he murdered Louis B., which some people have surmised was a killing to keep Louis B. away from his gold. The other episode was to go to the Stu Brown area that Brian had identified and pursue Brian's quest and his word belief that there was something there. Those two episodes were ready. We were on standby, and the weather turned not just sour, but unflyable, unhikeable. And 2 days in a row, they said the helicopters can't take off from this area, Maple Ridge. Stand down, but we'll call you later in the day if things clear, because we were going in for a few nights, particularly in the one up where the Stu Brown story comes from. So we were ready, but the weather thwarted us. Then they said, we're going to drive up to Whistler and we're going to go in the back way from the Whistler ski area, which many of your listeners will know of. We'll go in the back way and 4x4s over really rugged land. Then we'll hike in, sort of a variation of what the Stu Brown may have done. And we were on standby for that. We were ready. In comes the fog. In comes the bad weather. In comes the torrential rains, making it unable to go there. And then we just timed out, and all of a sudden the weather winter had set in. It was snowing. We weren't going to be able to find anything. Is that the curse, keeping Brian away from his spot that he is researched? I like to think that, because we know there's gold in the area. We know people have found gold in the area. What we can't do is put gold in Slumach's hands. We cannot, through our research, do that.
But nobody's looking for gold right at this very moment that we're on the air with this story. And yet, and we have beautiful weather, absolutely wonderful weather. You're not supposed to have sunny weather in British Columbia in January. And we have that right now. But on the weekend, in comes the snow. And we're going to have in the next week here in the Lower Mainland and in the Pitt area, we're going to, well, at least in where I live, we're going to have 8 inches of snow according to the forecast. That'll be even more up in the Pitt area. but nobody's up there looking for gold right now. So I don't think that the weather is a factor at all. When Rick's talking about 2015 here, we went into what was that, Rick? September, I think it was, that we were looking. We were ready to go looking.
Right.
But September is when it starts to rain in British Columbia, right? And it rained until it started to snow. And so is that the curse at work, or is it just British Columbia weather?
I think it's the curse.
Yeah,
Okay.
I like to think it's the curse. It's the curse that keeps the legend alive.
Yes.
Because it brings fear, and fear is a curious fuel. So with fear as fuel, a lot of people are encouraged to do things that are counter to their own safety, which again is why we underline, if one's going to go in there, be careful. There was a German film group, 2 separate occasions, came in. They had access to an airdrop, helicopter airdrop. They were in the high country. They were looking for Slumach's gold. Out of this came 2 different, truly highly popular documentaries in the German language, shown in the country of Germany, on Slumach's lost gold mine. But both times they needed to be rescued, the film crew taken out of there. And of course, that puts in danger the rescue crew. And it puts at risk those who are honor bound to go up and go into areas where others have inserted themselves into a terrible situation, perhaps ill-prepared, not sufficient food, maybe poor clothing, maybe tents that they didn't anchor, so they got blown away, lots of things like that. Somebody breaks a leg, whatever happens. So that's our admonition is be careful if you're going looking for Slumach's gold. Curse or no curse, it's country that can be very tough on you.
Yeah. Do you guys, it's kind of like Oak Island. Will this ever be solved, do you think? Will people ever find it?
The Oak Island folks have been searching now. I think they're in season 12, I read here just recently. And every time they go a little further down and they find another platform that's made of wood and all that sort of stuff. How long is it going to go? How long will that series continue? And who would go to all that work to dig down for whatever? I mean, there's got to be a reason why somebody, because there's no question that hole is there and that they are finding different levels and they are getting flooded out by somehow a pipe or something like that leads in from the ocean. There's no question that they have been thwarted time and again as they've been going down. And I believe they're in their 12th season of looking for this. Now, this could be very similar. This is 2 seasons with the Dead Man's Curse series. Could they still be going after 12 seasons looking for the mine? Consider that whole area around Pitt Lake, there's deep caverns, there's deep valleys, there's mountain peaks, there's all these tent-shaped rocks. They're all over the place. So let's go into this one because I think it's really in this creek here, and it's probably there, and you're 15 feet away from the next creek, which is where the gold is. That it's that difficult country up there. It's very forested. It's not like the American desert areas or the Red Rock area in Nevada or down in Arkansas or anything like that. It is very, very forested. So you can't be flying over in a helicopter and say, there's a tent-shaped rock. Let's go down and check that out. People have tried to do that.
And crashed, by the way.
And crashed. Yeah.
And crashed the helicopter. So, it's either at times ineptitude or a curse, or some conflating those 2. But you're talking to 2 guys that, along with friend Mary Trainer, the 3 of us have been at this a long time, and between books we continue to research, to gather things, to talk to people, and so that. To us, the legend is very much alive, and we've had our researchers sifters on, as it were, to try and see what can be left behind in the way of good storytelling, but honest storytelling. So we've had many great reviews about the new book, Slumach's Gold, and what has been acknowledged is that, you know, we come really clear about Indigenous rights and Indigenous voices not being heard in those days, and indeed maybe heard more now, but not adequately. So what was muted at that time because they didn't have access to listeners outside of their own community, and that, you know, those were harsh times, as you talked about earlier. You know, that lands taken from Indigenous peoples and secrets kept and truths buried. So there is that element, and you know, I don't know that had he been of a European descent, I don't know that a curse would have been attached to him and believed. But in the times of the late 1800s, early 1900s, it was something that could be attributed to an Indigenous person, and because of, again, fears or lack of understandings, could stick in a way that it wouldn't to a settler, that they had somehow cast this curse. So those contexts are really important to have a willingness to believe in things, sometimes because of our own ignorance.
I have a really quick question because we're just about out of time. Have you guys interviewed anybody from the Native tribe that he was a part of?
Yes, in sporadic fashions. The local folks, the local Indigenous people, and there are people alive today who are descendants of his family. They have said to us, everybody makes money off our boy Slumach, and we don't. So we want to pull back and not really be involved. And it's true. We're selling books. People sell television shows and so on. And so there's some bitterness there. And there was also a problem with the folks from Germany who were asked not to bother them, and they came in and bothered them anyway. And that was nothing to do with us at all. But it happened. And so they, you know, a couple of things like that, they said, you know, we're going to pull back. And we just don't want to be involved. It's not a nasty thing. It's not a fighting thing. It's not a huge thing. It's just, we're not interested in being involved.
It just is. So you told me earlier that the book is sold out.
Virtually sold out, yes. 2,500 copies were printed, and there were a few promo copies and things like that. And now people are, you know, they're contacting us and saying, I can't find your book. All the bookstores say they're sold out and we can't get any more. We were 12 weeks on the BC bestsellers list, and our publisher, you know, says, well, if you know, if we can find some in a bookstore, and if they've got 6 copies left, we can maybe get 3 back and put them over here to this bookstore and so on. But it's we're down to number 14 on the BC bestsellers list as of Monday, this past Monday, and that indicates that we're virtually sold out. People aren't buying it because it ain't there.
So our reprint's going to come, but Amazon has copies. We should always say that Amazon and some of the chains, the bigger chains, do have copies because they realized it was going to sell it. So they've protected some for them, so that there are places to find them. But yeah, we need to get the reprint in and do a big spring push. And you know, the book's so beautiful. It had a great fall audience because people wanted it as a gift book as well as a storybook. Come spring and summer, there's all sorts of people traveling around Western Canada that are going to see this book in racks and want it because they want to go back to the campfire that night and read about it, and they'll go find Slumach's Lost Gold.
And so the publisher is working on our second edition, or our second printing right now as we speak.
For the listeners out there, you have got to get this book. It's really good. It's called Slumach's Gold, In Search of Legend and a Curse. It is by the brothers Antonsons, Rick and Brian. And there's another one in here, Mary Trainer. So find it on Amazon, you guys. And thank you so much for coming on the show and being a part of
Thank
this.
you for having us. It's been
Well,
wonderful.
thank you. Yeah, this has been great. It's been nice to meet you this way. It's terrific.
Thank you. So, you've been listening to The Gateway, your portal to the unexplained, the mystical, and the otherworldly, broadcast live from United Public Radio Network 107.7 FM New Orleans. I'm your host, CL Thomas, and coming next week, I have a guest next week, and you know what? I don't know their name just yet. Didn't write it down, unfortunately. But stay tuned. I'll get that out soon. And also, magazine is going to be due Friday. So you guys should be able to get that on Friday. Until next time.